everybody. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centers, and your host for the third edition of our annual Cosmic Conference. This year, all about the employee experience. To better understand how to design great experiences for our employees, we are exploring this topic through a variety of lenses, from engagement to flexible work to moments that matter, retention, recruitment, upskilling, organizational strategy, office design, and today we'll be speaking together about mental health. Until October 21st, I'll be joined by amazing academics, managers, experts, leaders who will share their insights and experiences and perspectives on employee experiences. All that information about the sessions, the guests, the topic can be found on our conference website. We will link it for you in the comments. And before we begin, always show us some love, give this video a like, tag someone who you think might enjoy listening to us. And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Ask your questions. Scott and I will do our best to get to all of those questions before the end of the session. He's on top of it. Today's guest is Scott Armstrong, founder of mentl. Scott, who just left his role as editor-in-chief of Arabian Business, brings more than 3 decades of content creation, engaging audiences, and building communities to his vision at mentl. This new platform is determined to tackle the stigma of mental health head-on through the power of inspiring content and trusting thought leadership. And today, for Mental Health Day, they finally launched their website. So we're going to link that for you as well in the comments. You go and have a look and learn more about how they can help you. Scott's enviable regional network is built on more than a decade in the Gulf, spanning the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. He's a campaigning journalist throughout his career. He has highlighted so many different initiatives, including changing the UK law to protect children from kidnappers and being honored by Prime Minister Tony Blair for his job creation campaign. Skilled at uniting private and public sectors around causes, he is a passionate mental health advocate with a network of experts regionally and internationally. Scott, I'm so grateful that you joined us today.
I'm grateful for being invited. Thanks, Marilyn. After that intro, that my imposter syndrome just kicked right in.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trigger you so early in our conversation, but there's absolutely no reason. I mean, you really, I think it's always incredible when people who've done a lot of different things just bring the power of all of those different capabilities into something that they're passionate about. And what is more important than mental health, especially in the wake of the pandemic? So don't let your imposter syndrome creep in, just kick that out.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I said earlier, today is Mental Health Day, a day dedicated to raising awareness around mental health issues around the world. Funnily enough, it wasn't on purpose that we booked today's session. It was kind of just a calendar coincidence, but what a beautiful coincidence. And a beautiful coincidence that you just launched today as well. With 13% of the world's population struggling with a mental health condition and about 1 in 4 adults suffering from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year, we cannot talk about creating great employee experiences without discussing how organizations and leaders and individuals need to approach mental health at work. We know, of course, how important it is to support employees' mental health, including creating a culture of openness and trust and a space where people aren't afraid to say, I'm not feeling okay today. But today we'll discuss how we can create that in your organization and how leaders can support their employees' well-being while also taking care of their own. Scott and I were just talking about being solo founders before we started this session today, and over half of CEOs report struggling from a mental health condition. So it's very important that we're able to talk about this at all levels of the hierarchy. And we'll also be discussing how flexibility and diversity plays a role in improving stigma around this topic at work. So I'm going to stop talking and let Scott do the rest of the talking. Scott, start us off with why you left everything you were doing to start this organization and why mental health is so important for you.
Well, it's lived experience, and it's also almost like a professional experience as well, and also kind of the clock ticking. I'm hitting 50 this year, and sometimes you just kind of have the pandemic also lets you have a look at your purpose and your meaning. But I guess there are a few whys. The thing that really kind of bang opened my eyes to mental health and the power it has over us was about 3.5 years ago. My father, who was an incredibly successful man, built his own business. He kind of rose from nothing, very resilient man all his life, had a mental health breakdown, and within 3 months he was dead. And he was such a strong man that it kind of like we were all like, oh, Dad, he'll beat this, he'll get over it, and he absolutely didn't. And that kind of just like woke something in me where I started looking at my life, and I also started looking at me. I've gone through a few things. I don't need to unpack all of them, but a slightly difficult childhood, shall we say. Had a number of jobs, have worked in 33 years in a number of organizations that had toxic cultures. Let's just say over the 33 years, not to name any names. And I just thought of sort of, once you see it in yourself and once you see it in your family, you begin to see it everywhere. And you begin to see the kind of the impact it has on organizations, and also with Arabian business. I kind of went in there wanting to help. The business community at that point was going through the pandemic. They were really struggling. And I'd kind of decided that I wanted to do something that lifted people up. And actually there was a Saliha from the Lighthouse Arabia, Saliha Fridi. She wrote a big column about toxic leaderships and Arab sort of how it's really difficult to stand up to bosses because of the whole visa situation, and we don't want to lose our existence out here and that kind of thing. And that really just kind of spoke to a past experience of mine. So then I created a resilience channel and shared some of my experiences on LinkedIn. And I'm sure people tuning will recognize it. When the WhatsApp went off, my body would just go, "Ugh!" It would be a physical reaction. I would not sleep at night. Sometimes I would think that the boss was in the corner of the room looking at me as I was trying to get to sleep. So it was a lived experience. And then it all kind of came to fruition, it was just time. The universe basically just said, Scott, it's time to do something you're really, really passionate about. I've also got children, and I see them growing up in a really polarized, toxic world. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. I've got a 21-year-old boy. Second biggest killer of young men between 19 and 24 is suicide. So you worry about them as they make that adjustment, particularly when they make an adjustment from such a safe environment like the UAE into the wider world, and he's gone back to the UK. So yeah, it was, it's family really, 3 sort of main whys, which is my dad, me, and my children. Kind of like, right, there you go, time to do something with value.
I'm very sorry for your loss. Yeah, it definitely answers the question. And I'm sorry you had to experience that kind of loss. But I guess also grateful that you're now taking your energy and your capabilities and putting it into a topic like this.
Well, he was a businessman, so I think he'd have been proud. I'm just ashamed that we didn't have a conversation about mental health in the 68 years he was with us. But he was of a generation that didn't talk about it. And that kind of was like, we need to talk about it. We need to have open conversations about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that was going to be my first question. Being open about well-being and mental health are essential as a maybe starting point to facilitating these conversations in organizations. We know that it's important for leaders to be vulnerable, but in a lot of workplaces, the vision of leadership is, let's call it patriarchal, for lack of a better word, in the sense that you have that strong masculine leader who can take everything and weather the storms and doesn't budge and so on. And so it's incredibly hard to open up about this topic. What's the kind of advice that you give to leaders that are, considering taking that leap and being the vessel of this conversation?
Well, stop being terrified of yourself, frankly. Have your own conversation with you first. Fit your own oxygen mask first, and also start talking, because you need it. I mean, we see it. I mean, often conversations about mental health can turn into boss bashing, and sometimes they absolutely deserve it. But I would say that all the bosses who have been difficult to me or caused me issues in my lifetime, I look back on them and I'm sort of grateful for the lessons that I learned, because sometimes it's as important to learn not what to do as to what to do. But I also recognize that, bless them, they were absolutely terrified children, completely insecure, had no way of dealing with dissent or, team members that didn't agree with them. They've been thrust into positions of power, and their only way to kind of cope with that is hierarchy, is patriarchy, is how dare you talk to me like that, as opposed to listen. And don't get me wrong as well, like, I'm not going to be hypocritical here. As I grew up in journalism, which is is in general fairly toxic, or can be. And again, with that kind of patriarchal, hierarchical leadership style. So there will definitely been a point in my career when I was the abused to become the abuser. And it's taken me time to recognize that that kind of coaching mentality is the way to lead, if that's the term. That you are, in fact, and there's a guy called Julio Bruno that talks about this. He's the former global CEO of Time Out. He talks about servant leadership. You are there to help your team do their job to the best of their ability, a bit like a football manager is there to help because he's ultimately, it's his players who score in the field of play. He can't score the goals. His team needs to succeed. And he has to kind of create the environment for them to thrive. And you don't see many sports teams succeed that are ruled by fear. So that's the first thing. I think leaders really need to be honest with themselves and go, right, I've got issues. This whole idea that you talk about they need to be superhuman and they can't break. Unfortunately, they do break. And they break often. And if you're talking about the patriarchy, one of the biggest killers of men between 40 and 49 is suicide. And we would rather kill ourselves than face difficult conversations. We would kill ourselves rather than appear weak. When isn't it not much stronger to actually open up and have a conversation? So find yourself someone that you can talk to, but talk to yourself first and recognize that this whole idea that everything should be on your shoulders, it's not true. And it's kind of grown out of a leadership style that was been around for about 100 years, except 100 years ago, we didn't have digital economies. We didn't have social media. We didn't have stakeholders that were, convinced about ESG and equality, diversity, and inclusion. These days, the environment, the landscape, that old style management is just not fit for purpose. And that's even before we get into talent attrition, talent attraction, the Gen Zs, the millennials, this changing nature. I mean, right now, the CEO always used to be called the Chief Executive Officer. And now we've got McKinsey or PwC talking about the fact the CEO is now the Chief Empathy Officer or the Chief Emotion Officer. You've got guys who look like me in leadership positions are going, no, I don't know that. I can't even talk to myself. I'm repressed enough as it is, let alone talk to people in my team and try and be inspiring or listen or have emotions. They're like the guys in manufacturing plants when they brought in the robots to take over their jobs. All of a sudden, these guys needed a new set of skills. Leaders need a new set of skills because the foundation of leadership has completely changed underneath their feet. So we've got a lot of scared people in a lot of senior positions who have got a choice to make. And when I shut up and allow you to ask another question, we can talk about why they I told you getting me to shut up would be difficult, Marilyn.
Don't you worry. No, I was just going to say, like, your football metaphor also just made me think to tell our audience that if they haven't, they should go ahead and watch Ted Lasso. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's, spoiler alert. But Ted goes through his own mental health issue at some point in the process. And not only is he a servant leader and is quite keen on supporting his team through their own issues, be they mental health or otherwise, but he ends up being at the center of this plot himself, and I think absolutely comes to terms with the fact that he needs his own oxygen as well. Not to mention that the whole show is full of amazing leadership lessons in empathy, in humanizing the experience. And so I just wanted to tell our audience to have a look at that. But you were also mentioning towards the end of your response that leaders need a whole new set of skills. What's that skill set look like today?
Well, it is, as Adam literally just pointed out in the chat box. Vulnerability being a new superpower. You cannot be a leader with your backs to your team anymore. It's scary to open up, but it's how do you get the best out of your team? And you're not going to get the best out of your team by being, I think it's humanity, really. It's going back to actually as being humans and connecting with our team members as humans so that they feel human and they feel psychologically safe so they can thrive. And that's difficult. And I'm not sure anyone's really got the answers, but there are some people who are empathetic and naturally empathetic. And you can, and if you are, you're in, you've got a strong advantage. But there are people who are not naturally empathetic, and there are people who are introverted. But there are a set of skills that we can practice. I think listening, which is one of the things that I as a journalist, I'm supposed to be a really good listener, and I can listen to other people. And I know Simon Sinek says the same thing. He says it to someone he doesn't know, can listen all day long, but to the people around them, we tend to not listen as much. Active listening, I think, is a really good starting point for your leaders, because, and then just, if we can drop the fear and that actually we might not be right all the time, then you begin to listen and learn from your team, who might actually be telling you something you really need to hear. The business landscape is littered with stories of businesses that didn't listen to people in their organizations. Like Kodak, when someone said, "Oh, about this digital camera lark, no, we don't need those. That'll waste, that'll harm our film sales." And of course, that ended up, almost like destroying their company. It's the same with who was it who invented the Nokia? Nokia used to be huge. Smartphones, no, we don't need to do smartphones. Apparently, you did. And there would have been somebody younger piping up in the organization going, something's coming to disrupt the market, we should be there. Oh, shut up. So I think listening and dropping the fear is a good starting place for a leader these days.
So a couple of questions on that leadership piece, just to stay on it for a minute there. In the face of a crisis, everybody struggles, leaders and employees alike. We had the pandemic, then we had the Ukraine-Russia war, and now we have the global recession. Like, I think for the last few years, nobody's gotten a break, but particularly leaders haven't gotten a break, because they have to both create the right environment for their teams, but also achieve business results.
Yeah, totally.
Specifically, how do you have this discussion with your employees to say, I'm here for you, but I also need you to be here for me? And then there's a follow-up question from the audience here. Marie asks, how can employees support their co-workers, not their team members? So not leaders supporting people reporting into them, but simply peers supporting each other.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? In terms of leaders, again, that dropping the whole superhero act is the first step, I think. And Deb's literally just dropped in empathy. Empathy is incredibly important. That's going to be one of the key drivers moving forward for them. So that's it. Remind me again about the question again. Sorry, because I just got distracted by loads of comments coming in the chat box.
I'm reading the comments. I will manage those for you.
It's really good. The audience is actually asking really good questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was like a two-sided question. One is, in times of crisis, how can leaders ensure that their own mental health is taken care of? And then how can we also care for our peers, not just those who report into us?
No, totally. I think, and we will circle back, and I'm sure you've done this in other LinkedIn lives. Back to culture again. It's what is the environment? What's the environment of fear? I used to say to my team in Arabian Business, and guys will back me up on this. Look, we don't work in a hospital. We're not brain surgeons, and we're not rocket science. So the plane is not going to fall out of the sky. No one's going to die, so literally, I think almost every deadline that's been set is arbitrary, unless you are diffusing a bomb, or unless you are a rocket scientist, or unless you are a brain surgeon. The actual real implications for missing a deadline by an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, it's not real. We create these pressures. Now, do we want to lean in and succeed? Absolutely. Do we want to be the best we can? Absolutely. Do we want our employees, our teams, to want to win the league? Yeah, absolutely. But you ain't going to get there again through fear. You're only going to get there through collaboration, and you're only going to get there by being human and being flexible. And if somebody needs to go to the doctors, or somebody needs to go watch their son or daughter in a school play, or the Christmas nativity, or it's kind of like an old-fashioned give and take, which we seem to have lost. This whole idea that if I can't see you in front of me, then you are stealing from me. No, it's not. It's just not that way anymore. And we know that our employees are going to reject that. So we have to kind of be open to that. So kind of just like letting go to start with, and establishing clear goals, but then also establishing how are you going to get there might actually not necessarily be the way that you, the individual leader, thinks you're going to get there. There was you talk about great sports programs, there's Ted Lasso. There was another great one that I watched, which was called The Last Dance, which was all about the
NBA,
NBA.
right?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
NBA. Chicago Bulls going for their 6th championship, and it was all about Michael Jordan. It was primarily about Michael Jordan, one of the most amazing sportsmen athletes of all time. And he would often say, well, I love some of his quotes because he talks about, you miss all of the shots that you don't take. And he talks about also how many shots he's missed over his life. But the most interesting character in that documentary for me was the coach, Phil Jackson, I believe his name was.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a team of superstars. So not only did he have Michael Jordan, he had Dennis Rodman, and your audience members of a certain age will remember Dennis Rodman as quite a flamboyant figure. Now, Jackson could have gone, you will all do it my way, and that's it, or it's the highway. But he didn't. He allowed them, like Rodman would go off and he'd be off on a 5-day, let's not say what he was doing, but he was out there, But Jackson kind of knew that he would deliver the project on the day. He would turn up on court and he would play his absolute socks off, and they would win. And of course they did. They won their 6th championship, which is really interesting because these superstars all won their 6th championship. Phil Jackson then went to another team, the LA Lakers, and won another 6 championships. So there's something to be said for that style of leadership where you can give your team members freedom to be themselves. And that can be, I've actually learned that as well, that can actually be sometimes daunting for your employees as well, because they're often not used to being empowered to make mistakes. So then you've got to allow them to make mistakes and make sure that they're not scared to make mistakes. And I often, when I started down that road of, right, I'm going to empower my employees, I want a flat structure. There are some employees some team members who really sort of thrived. Really thrived and enjoyed that. But then there were others that were like, oh, I don't know, just tell me what to do. And I'm like, and that took me a while. And I wouldn't say I got 100% success at that either. To go, well, yeah, but I'm not wanting to dictate to you. I'm wanting you to step up and take responsibility and be empowered. But you need to know that, if you give it your best, you give it your best. And, the hell hath no fury won't come crashing down on your shoulders. So it's an interesting one because it's a different style of management. It's kind of easier to tell people what to do, but it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And if you can get it right, and I'm not going to claim I got it right at any point 100% of the time. But if you do get it right, then the rewards are there because you've got that empowered team that will deliver. You don't need to have that conversation, which is, oh no, I want to be nice, but you need to do your jobs. That if you get the culture right, they'll do that for you. If their purpose and meaning aligns with yours, then you're there already. You're all heading in the same direction, and they will sprint for you when you need them to sprint, but they can't sprint all the time, and you shouldn't expect them to sprint all the time. And I think that's where we get into that kind of quiet quitting, which is a bit of an inaccurate term, but that's kind of where the quiet quitting debate comes in.
I have a vendetta against that term, actually.
Yeah.
I really I think it's, don't hate me because I know you're a journalist, but it sounded to me like a journalist needed a soundbite.
Hey, don't blame me. Don't blame me. No, it's TikTok. Somebody needed a hashtag. So it's a hashtag TikTok.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong.
I tried looking at data behind quiet quitting, and it's like, I mean, it didn't sound like anything new to me. Like doing your job sounds like what people mostly do all the time. I don't know what you're talking about.
I know. I mean, I massively agree with you. I totally agree with you, and I think it's an inaccurate term because we talk about quiet quitting as if there's something wrong with just doing your job to the expected,
What's wrong with that?
level. And in every team there will be superstars and there will be team players. And actually, the teams don't function without the team players that are just there to pass the ball. I'm going to keep using sports analogies. There's a great footballer called Gary Neville back in the UK who played for Manchester United, and he had people like Beckham and Cantona and all that sort of thing. And he recognised, he said, I was the worst player on that team, but he worked his socks off and he passed the ball and he did his job exactly how he was supposed to do his job. And that was the team that kind of won 3 championships, 3 trophies in 1 year. So yeah, this whole idea that somehow not going 100, 110 or 120% all of the time is wrong. That's what I don't like about quiet quitting. And we've actually seen it. There was a very recent example, and I don't know if you see the UK, which is a bit of a dumpster fire at the minute right now with everything that's going on. But they've got train strikes going on, and there's train companies back in the UK that kind of operated that they were going to get 120% from their employees all of the time. And the minute that the employees withdrew their support for that, which basically called, work to right or something like that, the train company couldn't function anymore. Couldn't run the
Wow.
trains because it had built in goodwill. It had built in 120% all of the time. So it wasn't like I was asking you to step up and do me a favor. I was telling you you had to do above and beyond your wages and your hours all of the time for no extra reward. And it's wrong. And eventually, it's not sustainable. It's a risk. You carry on like this, eventually your house of cards will come tumbling down because it's just
Sure.
not sustainable.
Every good business leader knows that to build resilience, you have to build slack in your organization, and that means that you can't expect consistency up or down. Either way, you're going to have volatility, and you need to build in for that. You mentioned earlier, like a really interesting point that I want to dig deeper on, and Tala from the audience is also asking a question that's very comparable to the one I was interested in. You said sometimes as a leader, you want to create an environment where people can be leaders themselves and take ownership and kind of just run with it. But also some people don't want that. They don't feel comfortable in a non-hierarchical environment. To me, that comes a lot from maybe you're familiar with the Hofstede cultural dimensions. Different cultures have different relationships to hierarchy and operate better actually just by virtue of how they were socialized and brought up in more hierarchical contexts. Tala asked, and I had a similar question. Dubai is a very diverse society. We get people from everywhere. I think all nationalities are represented here, and no matter what organization you work for, you will end up working with 20, 30, 40 different nationalities. What are your thoughts around trying to navigate across cultural differences and diversity when it comes to the topic of mental health?
Again, I think it comes back to listen and learn, and I've seen it. I mean, I generally have. Like, I had one team member who really kind of struggled with the hierarchy, and I think again, as a leader, sort of letting go of the fear or letting go of the ego in some respects, because I did go through. I have no idea why this kid is not responding to the kind of the support and the praise and the compliments and the trying to build him up, but also give him. Tasks where he can achieve and build his confidence and that sort of thing. And I had to go and see his former boss and literally sit down with her and go, I don't know what I'm getting wrong. I had to admit that I was getting something wrong. And that's another thing that, again, we come back to the leaders about being vulnerable. We don't know everything. We can't know everything. The only person I know in my life who's right about everything is my wife. Outside of that, none of us have got it. None of us are omnipotent. So I think it is that's that starting point of, be prepared to accept that you might have got it wrong. And the more you listen and learn, the more you'll see it. And then you can kind of adapt to the situation. And I think if you can be honest and if you can be your authentic self with your team, then you will, and that's something that we're terrified as leaders, you will often be surprised at how that's rewarded back when they see you as a human being. You can have a human conversation. You can actually have a difficult conversation, because sometimes within teams we do have to have difficult conversations. Like, it can't be just stress-free. We're all zen, calm all the time, because that's not. Life's not like that, and sometimes the world of work's not like that. Sometimes even great teams have projects that either go wrong or deadlines get shifted forward or the client has something here. And as a team, sometimes you do need to have a difficult conversation. But if you can have an honest conversation where the person responding feels safe enough to respond, then I think that's the foundation for something special in an organization.
Yeah, and I think as a follow-on to that, at least my personal experience in leadership, and I do hope that I create a good space for my teams to thrive. They can call me out in the comments if I don't, but is actually that also different people need a different approach. I have, whether in today's team at Cosmic Centers or in previous teams of mine, I do also recognize that some people need a hierarchical boss that's on their case, and some people need creative flexibility and space to kind of, go away before they come back. And I try to also be a different leader to different people, obviously within the spectrum of my own capabilities. But you won't see me running the same kinds of one-on-ones with every single person on my team. I won't be speaking to them in the same way. I won't be giving them feedback in exactly the same way. Some people love, tough love, and some people need more nurturing. And I think as a leader, being able to navigate that spectrum is also a great skill to have. Earlier, I just want to bring up a question from the audience here. Rhea asks, how much is it important that when you're promoting a leader or like giving them a bigger team to manage, that you rely on, how empathetic that leader can be, or their ability to have that, chief empathy or chief emotional officer persona? How can you even measure that as an organization? Like, let's talk about how organizations bring mental health into the employee experience. Is that something that you advise, companies become a lot more conscious about and make it a requirement for their leaders? And otherwise, how do you upskill leaders that don't have that capability?
That's a very good question, Rhea, and a very big one as well, a very complete question. Yes, absolutely vital. And I think that's when I came back to what I said earlier about leaders being terrified. I think we've got lots of leaders, and I can talk about my lived experience as well. Like even my first leadership roles, when I was working, because I used to be a journalist, I used to be a writer, I used to be a reporter, so I go out and get stories. Rose through the ranks, was a chief reporter, and then you make this shift from being like the top of the writers to then being on the news desk. And in my profession, that basically meant you've got to try and figure out how to put a news list together. So what's the newspaper going to look like? What's on page 1? What's on page 2? What's on page 3? What's on page 4? And then you've got to go into your boss. And in my back in my day, that would be often a hierarchical. I was actually fortunate to have some groundbreaking female editors who were amazing, and they were actually great teachers. But a lot of the blokes were always very sort of bully boy hierarchical. Call this news list, whip it up in front of you, get out and get me another one. So you were focused on trying to do the technical aspects of your job. And I think CEOs for a long time have been focused on technically delivering the bottom line, the profits, no matter how you got there. And nobody ever taught us how to lead, never taught us the importance of emotional skills, or indeed never taught us the importance of looking after our own emotions, so that our own insecurities are not our team's. It's just because you feel terrified doesn't mean your team have to, and it's actually okay to be terrified, because we're all terrified if we're honest with each other. We're all apprehensive and insecure. None of us are. There might be a few out there, but no, when I was joking about imposter syndrome, I really wasn't joking about imposter syndrome. Had it all my life. So that whole, we need to build it in. I don't need to, and I don't need to shout from the rooftops for this, because right now you've got McKinsey, you've got PwC, you've got EY, you've got BCG. There isn't a single consultancy out there that thinks the future of the leadership is toxicity or hierarchy. Every single one of them is saying, that empathy and emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence and empathy don't necessarily have to be the same thing, are the key. I think McKinsey calls them the alphas, which is a very male hierarchical way of describing it, because I think they're trying to talk to a very male hierarchical, audience. But there isn't a single there isn't a single report or piece of research that points to the direction of travel being back to toxicity, less well-being, less emotional connections. There isn't. And even if you look at, I think in where I come from, or in many Western countries, the private sector often innovates first, and then the public sector follows them. Here in the UAE, it's the reverse is true. In fact, the public sector innovates first. We saw it with the 4.5 working day week, which there was a couple of reasons. One, it was to align with global markets, so there was a financial reason for it. But the government put in black and white, work-life balance matters. We are doing this for wellness reasons, as well as global financial markets and XYZ. They have been on stage at Davos talking about reduced presenteeism, which is actually more expensive to companies than absenteeism, but also reduced absenteeism as well, increased productivity. They're on Davos on one of the world's global stages going, yes, a 4.5 working day week has worked, or it's already seen the positive dividends from it. The UK has just done an experiment with about, I can't remember, hundreds of companies that embraced a 4-day week. And at the end of the experiment, 88% of those companies said they were going to stay with the 4-day week. So to go back to your original question, said Scott, going off on another completely train of thought, we absolutely should be building this into it. We should be building it into, I think Deloitte have talked about this as well, where, if you're going to be on the executive level, you used to have to do an MBA. Yeah. If you want to get into the C-suite, they'd send you to do an MBA if you hadn't already done one. So where in that MBA is the emotional intelligence? Because if these are all the new skills for the leaders, then that has to be in the MBA, and MBA or not, I never went to university. I was a journalist since I was 16 years old, so I got no degrees. I got 5 GCSEs. I got a U in geography. Had no idea where I was. I've done okay, but when you're going through the leadership and rising through the leadership, it needs to be built in. That vulnerable leadership, servant leadership, emotional skills, it absolutely has to be part of the almost psychometric testing. If you're an air traffic controller, you have to pass psychological tests, because you have to have that mentality to be a proper lead, to be able to cope with that amount of pressure. Now, I'm not saying that we have to go that far with leaders, but we do need to build this in robustly into organizations so that we get the right people in leadership positions. Because when we get the wrong people in leadership positions, it can be it's terrifying for them. It can break them, and before they break, they often break other people. So this whole so we're not doing them any favors. Just because someone's good at doing one thing doesn't necessarily make them a great leader. David Beckham might be a great striker, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a great football manager. He probably he's annoyingly talented at everything, but
So I have a follow-up question to what you're talking about, which is, I often feel like mental health feels like a bit of an add-on in most organizations, in the sense that, and I've heard actually people talk to me about this before, where they feel like their organizations are a bit hypocritical when it comes to mental health. Like, they'll have the coaching session, they'll have the occasional workshop, they'll tell everybody that mental health is important, but the reality on the ground is that the behavior is completely, signaling other things. Yeah. How can we as organizations make sure that mental health is ingrained in every way that we work rather than bolted on? Because I tend to feel like, we'll bring a coach and we'll bring someone to do, some, I don't know, mindfulness exercise, but it feels superficial. How can we put mental health at a deeper level?
Well, here's the hopeful thing. I don't think that organizations have got much choice, frankly, because of a number of reasons. And I think mental health and well-being is kind of where ESG was, the environment, sustainability and governance was 5 years ago. Whereas we used to, and almost like what we had digital transformation, 10 years ago, where it used to be one isolated department, and they were where the digital people, they're over there, where the ESG people, they're over there, and as they've become more and more important to the marketplace, to the stakeholders, to the shareholders in organizations, those disciplines, if we call them that, have been democratized throughout the entire companies. Every company now is a digital company. Every employee is now a digital employee. In terms of ESG, the boardrooms now have to comply, because to not do so is a risk to their future sustainability. And there's a really interesting guy called Mark Mobius, who's a fairly smart fellow. He's known as the godfather of emerging markets, and he took a $50 million fund and he turned it into 50 billion. And he started out investing in companies that had strong ESG policies. And he said, look, if they've not got that, then they're a risk and I'm not going to invest in them. And then he wrote a white paper which said ESG plus C, which is ESG plus culture. And again, his thesis for all of his investments is that if your culture stinks, I'm not going to invest in you because that is a risk. What really interesting is if you read his white paper, he even takes account of the Glassdoor scores of companies when he looks at investing in. And I've said this before, but if nothing else should strike terror at the heart of CEOs and HR leaders, is that your ability to attract investment for the future of your company is linked back to what people say when they leave you. Ooh, that's going to be awkward, isn't it? That's an awkward conversation to have, and we have people, leave us, and I've always been a big believer in, saying goodbye as well as you say hello, because
Yeah.
if someone's come and contributed to them, let them go. And I've worked with companies as well, and I've always raged against it as well when they go, well, they've left us so they could never come back. Like, what do you mean? So you mean they knew us, they went and learnt new skills, and they want to come back to us? That's
And you
actually
don't want
brilliant.
them.
That's brilliant. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to highlight, since you brought up, how companies treat people when they're coming in and when they're walking out. Something that we do as a company, and we've had a lot of people come and leave because we've had a lot of interns or people who were with us for like a 3 or 6 month contract. We actually have a ritual that we love that I'll just highlight here, which is that when somebody leaves us, we actually have something that's called a graduation ceremony. And we have a little session that everybody in the team kind of writes down their favorite thing about that person, what that person has contributed that's meaningful to the organization. And on the opposite end, we ask that person who's leaving to give us, their best memory, but also their advice for us moving forward. And when somebody new joins, actually going through the graduation wall is part of the ritual as well of our onboarding, because we recognize that every person has, given us something, and that contribution isn't going to disappear. Like even in, hopefully 20 years, if Cosmic Centers, when it's still around, that graduation wall will be massive. But it's really, I think, very important to integrate these things into every moment and every ritual and every step. That's why I say, like, mental health isn't like a bolt-on. It's something that you should have in your one-on-ones, you should have in your onboarding, you should have in how you structure work or distribute it, or every decision you make as a team can take that into account.
Yeah, and I've never got it. I mean, we're on LinkedIn right now, so I'm going to give a shout out to one of my former team members, Nabila, who came to me. We actually started Arabian Business on the same day, and I watched her grow and learn and get better and better at her craft in the 2 years that she was with us, or just less than 2 years. And in the end, LinkedIn, global platform, came along and went, actually, we want your team member. I, as a leader, should be taking that as a massive compliment. That's not to say that my organization was small in any way, but all of a sudden, and she went on to be an advocate, for us, or at least an advocate for the coaching style of management we've got. And it's like, that's what you want. You're creating your future advocates. And how are you going to get new talent through the door is through advocacy. Going back to your previous question about how you build it into organizations as well, it comes back to the leaders, unfortunately, and the leaders fitting their own oxygen masks. I can see Mark actually has posted a question just talking about leaders taking too much on themselves, and that ability for them to fit their own oxygen mask, that has to be built into company cultures, because ultimately, I would almost argue that therapy should be mandatory for anyone in CEO, in CEO land, in the C-suite, because if you can't see the wood for the trees, then you're not going to make great decisions, and you're going to pass that down the line. And it's, I hate to use the word trickle down, because Liz Truss back in the UK has probably mucked that term up, but it needs, mental health needs to cascade through organizations. And if it's not championed from the very top, and if the leader does not see the benefit of it, and the sad thing is if they actually do talk about it, and if they do see the benefit, they themselves will be better leaders. But it needs to cascade through, because if the middle management don't think the boss, if you pay lip service to it and nothing changes, then nothing changes. And I actually think you're going to hell in a handcart if you don't. And on the flip side of that, no, I call companies that are not embracing mental health zombies. I think they're the walking dead. There are so many fundamental indicators, and I can get into those, as to why companies that don't change their cultures will be out of business in 5 to 10 years. That's it. It's not sustainable. Mark Mobius, $50 billion, smart guy, he believes the same thing. It needs to be from the very top all the way down.
I have one last question before we go to our rapid fire. which is like, I totally hear you about leaders and middle managers and leading the way and having those conversations and creating space and asking people how they're doing and caring for their well-being. I have a question about mental health conditions that may be a little bit more serious, right? Like, 'cause we're not dealing with, not that one is less serious than the other, but maybe where you're not professionally qualified to deal. You might be able as a human to help somebody deal with maybe their anxiety or their stress levels. You may be less qualified as a leader to help them deal with PTSD or abuse or conditions that might require professionals to support people through them. How do you advise leaders to deal with situations where you're talking about this type of mental health?
Just be a human being. Literally start by being a human being. Yes, no, you're not a professional, but that doesn't stop you being a human being. That's a really good starting point. And if you can create that psychologically safe space that your employee can open up and talk about it, and then you can encourage them to, you can point them. You can be there to support them, but you can point them in the right direction of the help they need to get. And in some respects, and I know she won't mind me mentioning her, but Lauren, who was one of my team members back at Raby Business, I mean, she had depression and ADHD, and she was very open on it. She wrote some very brave columns about it for a Raby Business, and there are some, like the job role she came in with, there were some aspects of that job that were really bad for her, just really, really bad for her. Whereas when she's a writer and a researcher and an analyst, and she's not inside an office where things are pinging all the time, she's superhuman. So sometimes what we see is the condition with, oh no, it's actually a superpower if it's treated the right way, in a way, which is, and I think as we look forward, we see certainly ADHD very much on the rise in our kids. We're going to have, much more neurodiverse workforces moving forward. People are going to, and we would remember that people used to just suffer in silence about these. And now they don't, because they recognize that that's actually not healthy for them or their families. So I think, again, it's that human being and just recognizing that, do you know what? We don't have to have all the answers. Nobody's right all the time. Nobody has to have the answers, but you've got to be willing to have the conversation and willing to kind of, if you can create the honesty, if you can create that psychologically safe space, then you can help. I also do believe, and it's something that at mentl we will campaign for, I think mental health first aid training should be mandatory in organizations. Right now, we've got physical first aid training. So if you have, I don't know, I think something like over 50 employees, you have to have at least one physical first aider. It's great,
Right.
and that's important. It is important. But why isn't that important for mental health? We're in this position right now where, I mean, it confuses me where if you think about the median cost of an employee, say an employee costs you $150,000 a year. If you bought a piece of machinery for your business that cost you $150,000, you would maintain that machinery. You would hire people to look after the machinery, except we live in a knowledge economy now. So our human beings are our machinery, for want of a better term. So where are the people to maintain our engines of output for our organizations? It's just good business sense to look after our talent. I
agree more.
don't understand why the chief financial officers are not screaming about this. There's research, there's all sorts of research and figures, but for every dollar you spend in this space, you get $4 back. There are other things coming down the line. Legislation is changing year on year. There is liability. Unfortunately, bosses, organizations, you're not going to get away from this. And it's a train that's coming down the track. So you can either jump on board it, to quote Bobby, I'm going to give you a shout out here. You can jump on board the train or you can get run down by it. It's your choice.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Such a great closing answer. We are going to go to our rapid fire questions, but Scott, I have to tell you, there's like so many questions in the comments, and maybe later you can go and answer. There's a couple we didn't have time for, but maybe you can pick that up in the comments after the show is over. So let's move on to our rapid fire questions as we wrap up today. I'm going to start 4 statements and I want you to finish them. The first one is, great employee experience is.
positive, purposeful, and meaningful.
Beautiful. The book that every leader should read today?
I have got two actually. Practical
Mhm.
Helps, a book called When by Daniel Pink, which has got some really good practical tips for leaders. Second book, which is all about purpose, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. The premise of which is if you live to 80, you get 4,000 weeks. We do not have much time on this planet, so use that time as well as you can.
That's terrifying. Only 4,000 weeks. I
I
need to
know.
get to it. The ideal workplace is,
Psychologically safe.
and the secret ingredient to a great employee experience is.
Culture.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know how crazy it must have been leading up to your launch today. So
No,
I'm
thank you,
doubly
Adam.
grateful that you joined
I
us.
can see that loads of these questions as well. Adam's really good there as well. He's talking about, asking people, are you okay? And I think the common wisdom is ask twice because, the first answer you get is fine. And then the second one, if you drill again, you might just get it. So Adam, thank you for some of your observations because they're absolutely spot on.
Yes, I think we had amazing members in the audience today. Shout out to
Absolutely.
all of them,
You didn't need me.
actually.
You
So
just needed these guys talking.
I know, I didn't need to prepare. So, as always, a big thank you actually to our attendees. And if you're still with us, do join us this afternoon. We'll be talking to Gillian French from WorkVivo about how to think about moments that matter in the employee experience and how to design memorable and joyful, moments for your employees. So please do join us later today at 5 p.m. UAE time. Scott, once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to our audience, and a big thank you to my team who does all the heavy lifting in the background, and I just have to show up and not mess up their great work. So as a way of thanking them, please do follow us if you don't already. Sign up to our newsletter. Every time we get a little notification that tells us someone new has signed up or joined the conference, we do a little happy dance. So it'll make our day. Thank you again so much for everybody who joined us, and we'll see you later today.